2 years late and at a budget of $3.5 million. The inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaigns, otherwise known as the Allan inquiry, released its report today, and it landed with it was underwhelming, shall we say. I'm going to talk to Professor Martin Olszynski, Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary, about it's really something, this report. You must take a gander. So Martin, welcome to the interview.
Thanks, Markham, for having me.
As with many things with this government, I'm almost at a loss for words about how bad something is, and that applies to this report. Can you give us a brief overview of this thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I'm sort of torn. On the one hand, I agree that it's entirely underwhelming, and so the main findings, of course, are that as best as Allan could figure, after 2 years and $3.5 million, is that about $54 million was dedicated to sort of what we might consider anti-Alberta resource development campaigns over the course of 16 years, right? So roughly, if we, at least in terms of proposed budgets, we're talking about 1.5 years of the war room, right, or the Canada Energy Centre. And in that context, he says also, of course, that nobody did anything wrong. Not even just that, the minister was saying today that, well, he found nothing unlawful, but we didn't ask him to do that. Well, that's true, but he also said that they did nothing improper or anything that should be impugned in any way. Now, so that's the fine print, and there's a lot else that he says in there. And I want to make clear that, I still have a ton of problems with this report, both procedurally and substantively. But at the very least, there is that nuance and those important caveats, right? He goes on to say that although he details these campaigns, hundreds of pages of these campaigns, he can't say that they caused the rejection or anything like that. So nevertheless, there are all these pages of campaigns, and that's what the minister today was trying to get really everybody outraged about.
Well, that is the thing. I mean, the meat of it was in a couple of paragraphs, or maybe a couple of pages, and the rest of it was all very clearly designed to, it was a sleight of hand. I mean, on the one hand, look over here, or here's the Nothingburger, but look over here and get outraged and be angry at this little bit of money, and they got the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and they've got the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, and everybody's outraged, and there's nothing to be outraged about. It's the biggest Nothingburger in the history of Nothingburgers.
Well, and I mean, I haven't done a systematic review of Nothingburgers recently, but I think I agree with you. But I think we have to remember, right, that this isn't, when we think about the audience and the intended target, right, for this report, again, the minister made it very clear today. She was doing everything she could to whip up rage and anger and sort of animosity from oil and gas workers. And she wants them to pour over these pages of campaigns and reports and congratulatory messages, which of course are standard fare in this context. Of course, advocacy groups are going to take their wins where they can. That doesn't mean that they're celebrating the death of jobs, right? And one of the things I find actually very interesting is that, the NGOs, in their limited ability to reply to Mr. Allan, they made it very clear, we weren't opposed to jobs. We've always advocated for a just transition. We've advocated for different jobs, and that we have always expressed that concern for workers. And he actually doesn't reflect that at all in his report. And not surprisingly, then today, the minister just went on that took that spin approach, right, to say that these groups were dancing on the graves of jobs. And of course, it's the furthest thing from the truth. These groups were concerned about climate change, which is a concern for you and I and everybody else.
Well, let's get serious about this, because regular energy media readers will know that I wrote a debunking of Vivian Krause back in May of 2019, that I think was the first serious attempt to grapple with her accusations of foreign-funded activism or foreign funding of pipeline and oil sands opposition, and just kind of dismantled it from that side of things. And then Sandy Garasino from the National Observer dismantled Ms. Krause's arguments from the charity and financial end of things. And I think between the two of us, we basically proved that the whole thing was a smokescreen, and that all was reflected in the report. The Allan report at the end of the day is consistent with how the government, the industry, and so on have conducted themselves against the opponents of people who are arguing for climate change and against the oil sands. So here's my question after that little bit of dissertation on my part. This seems to me to be an attempt to oppress dissent, to suppress dissent, to the people who don't like the oil sands and want to see GHG emissions go down shouldn't have a chance to make their positions known. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And that's been I think one of my sort of the driving forces for my own involvement in this thing is that, right out of the gate, the premier and his cabinet conflated dissent with disloyalty, right? So it's no longer the case. So essentially the precedent set here, of course, is that if you dissent, if you disagree with the government, and this government in particular, they will label you a traitor. You will be anti-Alberta. And Mr. Allan goes through great pains and great efforts to try to say that anti-Alberta is not a slur and that he doesn't mean it in a bad way. It really just was a geographic modifier. But everybody knew that that was not a tenable position. They warned him that that wasn't a tenable position. And today, Ms. Savage validated all of those concerns because no one's reading that fine print, or at least not their intended audience. And so absolutely, and I made the comment and I've written that, there's on the basis of this precedent, all the folks who oppose coal mining could be labeled anti-Alberta right away, right? Because engaging in anti-Alberta energy campaigns. And yet they have these legitimate concerns about selenium, about species at risk, right? And so it's no different with the oil sands. People had legitimate concerns about GHGs, about tailings, about impacts to the lower Athabasca River. But all of that gets swept aside and they're labeled anti-Albertan, and their valid and legitimate concerns are reduced to wanting to punish apparently Albertans for no reason, just because out of some like weird animosity, which of course doesn't exist. It doesn't make sense and it doesn't exist.
Yeah, this is a real problem. And I mean, the attempts to use the power of the state to suppress dissent over something that, express legitimate, constitutionally protected right to dissent is something that we really should be exercised about. I mean, this is a very serious problem with this government amongst many. And but you understand public inquiries. I've interviewed you a couple times about this before. How would you compare this to other public inquiries, whether at the federal or provincial level? Has there ever been anything quite like this?
Yeah, I mean, and it's, to my knowledge, is without precedent, right? And I haven't been around maybe that long, but when I confer with my colleagues who have been around a bit longer than myself, they're quick to say the same thing. And so there have been a host of irregularities, and along the way, and I've talked about some of them. I mean, and again, I've mentioned, in one hand, I'm encouraging people to sort of like read the nuance, like that even Allan couldn't escape a more nuanced discussion, but there's tons that he left out, and he was able to leave that stuff out because he never created a public record. He has reserved to himself the right to slice and dice the public record. So for instance, the fact that, he says he can't assess the veracity of claims made against the oil sands, or that he doesn't want to engage in a debate about whether or not they were responsible. He had all those reports because I provided them to him. Expert reports written by parliamentarians, legislature, former deputy ministers, the Radke report, Royal Society of Canada oil sands report. So he had all that information, and he chose not to include it in the public record. And then he makes excuses for not engaging on some of those controversial core issues. And so from that perspective, it's totally unprecedented. The lack of disclosure to the parties, the incredibly abbreviated timelines for engagement, and then substantively, again, as an example, I don't think that the minister could have gone on about killing jobs today if Mr. Allan had accurately reflected the submissions from the NGOs that, of course, they were concerned about jobs. So they made that very clear to him. He chose not to include that, and it allowed the minister to go on sort of her sort of rant today about killing jobs. And so these are the problems. And I'm hopeful that there will be some kind of accountability at some point for those things.
Well, let's talk about that. What kind of accountability can there be? And will some of the groups that have been named in this report, are they going to sue? Is there grounds for a suit?
Yeah, I mean, so the classic way to challenge this kind of report is to file what's called a judicial review application. So judicial review it's not a personal injury. You're not suing for damages. It's essentially a form. It's what we call a remedy in administrative law. And the idea would be to say to the court, you need to scrutinize this thing. And because we say there are errors, we say there are procedural errors on the one hand and substantive errors. And of course, when courts do this kind of stuff, they are mindful of the context and of their limited democratic mandate and institutional capacity. So they're inclined to defer, but that deference isn't, let's just say it has bounds. Essentially the commissioner has to have acted reasonably and has to have been procedurally fair. And I think that there are strong arguments to be made that this report is lacking on both those fronts. And we'll have to see. I think environmental groups are assessing the situation, they're assessing the report and the fallout. I think in the court of public opinion, they're going to do just fine. I think the media today wasn't fooled for 1 second, I don't think, during Ms. Savage's press conference. And so the question becomes, is there also room here to say there needs to be judicial scrutiny to essentially to correct what is otherwise a really bad and dangerous precedent, as we discussed, in terms of democratic norms around freedom of expression and procedural fairness.
And just to wrap up the interview, Martin, I want to make a point about something that was in the press release, where they said, okay, they've done all the environmental groups have done all these horrible things. And it's really good that we did this report because they might do them again. They might do them around hydrogen, and they might do them around carbon capture and storage. And it's like they created this the green scare of what might be coming yet, and they're going to use this report as the foundation for further criticisms and activities against environmental groups and others who criticize them. And I think that did you get the same impression?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and so a few things there. I mean, on the one hand, right, one of the things I thought is there were moments where the Minister Savage was very honest. I think that this is like a grudge. Like this is essentially like a vendetta for her personally, and for cabinet and for Kenny and for some of the cabinet. I mean, I think they're really pissed off, frankly, that environmental groups had any sway, and that that they've had any kind of influence on Canadian environmental law and policy, and Alberta environmental law and policy. And so just this real grudge, and wanting to punish these groups for it. But I think you're exactly right, foreshadowing, I used to always say that really what this was about was stigmatizing and delegitimizing these groups to try to prevent them from raising funds in Alberta, from preventing companies from associating with them. And so that is totally consistent with her now saying, these are going to be the next battles. And she wants to ensure, or try to ensure, that these same groups are stigmatized, that they aren't allowed to participate in the debates around some of these things. And of course, their participation is crucial because this government will cut corners, and will make sweetheart deals to the industry, and not enforce and not monitor. And we've seen that's been the story for the last 2 years. And so already they see what a threat, a sort of a strong, capable, charitable sector, especially in this sector, the environmental sort of field is. And she's just trying to delegitimize them before they get started. And I hope she fails, obviously.
Well, and I think we should end by pointing out that you reminded me of this when you said that it was a grudge, and that the one project that was canceled, the one pipeline project that was canceled, was Enbridge's Northern Gateway. And before she became minister, Minister of Energy, Sonia Savage, for many, many years, was the vice president. She was in charge of lobbying for Enbridge. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like this is her own cudgel to get back at her old enemies. They caused her so many troubles during the Northern Gateway battles of 10 years ago. But
the great irony, of course, right, is that project was ultimately, the approval was overturned by the Federal Court of Appeal because there was insufficient consultation, and that's really what stopped it. And then we had a change in government. And yes, the Trudeau government sort of said, yeah, we're not going to go and try to redo that one the way they did with TMX. But a lot of people would tell you that it was a futile thing anyways, in the sense that that opposition was very different in kind. That project was very different in kind to TMX in large measure, because it was a greenfield site, right? And so, and a greenfield project. And so, you know, it's just this like, honestly, this juvenile rage against these organizations that is that doesn't even actually reflect the reality of these projects and the circumstances under which some of them met their demise.
My goodness, I don't know what to say. I mean, this comes on the heels of the Kenney government's mismanagement of the COVID pandemic and so many other issues. They just seem to be piling up. Anyway, thank you, Martin, for this. Really appreciate your insights.
You're very welcome, Markham.